Story 1: The Man in the Window. I used to love living alone. I cherished the quiet, the freedom, the peace of coming home after a long night shift and curling up in bed without any distractions. But after that night, I don't think I'll ever feel safe by myself again. I'm a nurse, which means I work odd hours. Late nights, early mornings, double shifts, I've done it all. I live in a small, older apartment complex on the outskirts of town, mostly filled with elderly residents. It's not the nicest place, but it's affordable, and it's always been quiet. At least I thought it was. The first sign. It started with small things. Things I brushed off at first. One night, I came home around 2 a.m., exhausted from a brutal shift. As I walked up to my door, I had this odd feeling, like someone was watching me. I shook it off, blaming it on paranoia. After all, I worked in an ER. My nerves were always on edge. But then I noticed something strange. My blinds, which I always kept closed, were slightly open. Not enough to be obvious, but enough that someone could peek inside if they wanted to. I hesitated at my door, looking over my shoulder. The hallway was empty. I told myself I must have left them like that and went inside, locking the door behind me. The ominous discovery. A few nights later, I was heading out for another shift. I glanced at my window as I locked my door, and that's when I saw it. A smudge. A faint, greasy outline on the glass, right where someone's face would be if they had pressed against it. My stomach twisted. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe it had been there for a while. But deep down, I knew better. Still, I forced myself to leave for work, convincing myself I was being ridiculous. I told myself I'd clean the window in the morning and forget about it. But I never got the chance. Because that night, things got worse. The terrifying encounter. I got home around 3 a.m., drained and half asleep on my feet. The moment I stepped inside, I felt uneasy. It was that same feeling, like someone was watching me. I locked the door, checked the windows, and made sure everything was in place. I even turned on every light just to shake the eerie feeling off. Then, as I was about to head to my bedroom, I heard it. A soft tapping sound. I froze. It was coming from my window. For a moment, I couldn't move. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a tree branch, or maybe I had imagined it altogether. Then it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. My breath caught in my throat. I forced myself to turn and look. And that's when I saw him. A man stood outside my window, his face partially obscured by the reflection of my apartment lights. But I could see enough. His lips were stretched into the widest, most unnatural grin I had ever seen. His eyes were locked onto mine, and he was watching me. The escape. I staggered back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. My hands fumbled for my phone as I forced myself to keep my eyes on him. That's when he tilted his head. Slowly, like he was amused, like he was enjoying the fact that I was terrified. I barely managed to dial 911 before I heard it. The sound of my doorknob turning. He wasn't just watching me. He was trying to get in. A sob caught in my throat as I backed away, pressing my phone to my ear while my shaky fingers gripped the nearest heavy object. A lamp. 911. What's your emergency? There's a man outside my window. I choked out. He's trying to get in. Please, send someone. The operator's voice was calm, but I could barely hear her over the blood rushing in my ears. I heard her say something about staying on the line, but all I could focus on was the sound of my door rattling. And then silence. For a few agonizing seconds, there was nothing. No tapping, no movement. Just the hum of my refrigerator and the distant sound of a siren approaching. I crept toward the peephole, my breath shaky. He was gone. But before relief could fully settle in, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The lock. It was turned halfway. He had almost gotten in. The aftermath. The police arrived within minutes. They searched the area, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no forced entry marks. Nothing. But then they checked my window. There, smeared onto the glass, was something even worse than the greasy smudge from before. A handprint. Large, clear, and pressed right where his face had been. They took my statement, but without any security footage or real evidence. there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to be cautious, to call them if anything else happened. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my locked bedroom, gripping a kitchen knife, jumping at every sound. The next morning, I bought new locks, reinforced my windows, and seriously considered breaking my lease. A few days later, one of my neighbors, a sweet older woman named Mrs. Carter, told me something that made my blood run cold. A man had been arrested in a complex a few streets over. He had been caught lurking outside a woman's window, watching her. When the police searched his car, they found a knife and rope in the trunk. And the worst part? When they showed his mugshot on the news, I felt like I was going to be sick. Because it was him, the man in the window. I don't live there anymore. I moved out a month later. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there somewhere watching, waiting, and I will never feel safe alone at night again. Story 2: The Vanishing Hitchhiker. I've always been a night owl. Maybe that's why working as a delivery driver never bothered me. Something about the empty roads, the hum of the engine, and the occasional eerie silence made me feel at peace. But after that night, I don't think I'll ever feel comfortable driving alone again. This happened a few years ago. I was working late, making deliveries for a small courier service. It was around 2 a.m., and I had just finished my last drop-off. I was heading home, taking the back roads like I always did. The highway was empty, stretching out for miles with nothing but trees and darkness on either side. Then I saw her, the encounter. She was standing on the side of the road, just past a broken-down mile marker. At first, I thought she was just a shadow, a trick of my tired eyes. But as I got closer, I realized it was a woman. She was wearing a pale dress, almost white, and it looked old-fashioned, like something from the 1950s. Her long, dark hair fell over her shoulders, and she stood perfectly still, facing the road. I slowed down without even thinking. It was late, too late for someone to be walking alone in the middle of nowhere. Maybe her car had broken down, or maybe she had been stranded. As I pulled up beside her, I rolled down my window. "Hey, you okay? Do you need a ride?" She turned her head slowly, her face partially hidden by her hair. Then, in a soft, almost whispery voice, she said, "I need to go home." Something about the way she said it made my skin crawl. But I ignored the feeling. It was late and she looked so out of place. I couldn't just leave her there. "Hop in," I said. She nodded and slid into the back seat without another word. The odd feeling. As I pulled back onto the highway, the air inside the car felt off. I don't know how to explain it. It was like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was sitting perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead. "You got a name?" I asked, trying to break the silence. She hesitated. Then, in that same quiet voice, she said, "Eleanor." I nodded. "Nice to meet you, Eleanor. Where am I taking you?" She lifted a hand and pointed down the road. "Just keep driving." A shiver ran down my spine. Something about her voice. It was almost too soft, like it didn't quite belong in the car with me. I tried to shake the feeling off. Maybe she was just scared, or shy. Maybe something had happened to her, and she didn't want to talk about it. But then I noticed something strange. Her dress. It didn't look wet exactly, but it had this odd, damp appearance, like it had been left in the rain to dry. And then there was the smell. Not strong, but faint, like wet earth, like a riverbed. The vanishing act. We drove in silence for a while. The road stretched on, empty and dark. Then, I glanced at the rearview mirror again, and she was gone. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. My hands gripped the wheel as I turned in my seat, expecting to see her curled up on the floor or maybe ducking down. But the back seat was empty. The car door had never opened. I never heard a sound. She was just gone. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the empty seat, trying to process what had happened. My brain couldn't make sense of it. People don't just vanish. But she had. And that's when I noticed something else. The seat where she had been sitting was wet. The chilling truth. I didn't drive home right away. Couldn't. Instead, I pulled into the nearest gas station, still shaking. The clerk was an older guy, probably in his 60s, sitting behind the counter with a newspaper. I must have looked pale as hell because the moment I walked in, he raised an eyebrow. "You all right, son?" I swallowed hard. I I think I just saw something. Or picked someone up." His expression darkened immediately. "Where?" I told him about Eleanor. About the pale dress. The damp smell. The way she just disappeared from my back seat. As I spoke, his face lost all color. When I finished, he just shook his head. "You ain't the first," he said. My blood ran cold. He leaned forward on the counter, lowering his voice. "Years ago, a girl named Eleanor drowned in the river near that highway. Some say she was running from something. Some say she was pushed. No one really knows. But ever since then, people see her, late at night, standing by the road, waiting." I felt sick. "And she just disappears?" He nodded. "Always." I didn't know what to say. I stood there for a long moment trying to make sense of everything. Then the clerk sighed and pulled something from under the counter. A small, wooden cross on a keychain. "Take this," he said. "Next time you see her, don't stop." Aftermath. I barely slept that night. The next day, I checked my back seat again. The damp spot was gone. The smell was gone. But that feeling, the one I had when I saw her for the first time, never left me. I never took that road at night again. Not even once. And I never, ever stopped for hitchhikers. But sometimes, when I drive past that stretch of highway during the day, I swear I feel something. A chill in the air. A whisper on the wind. And once, just once, I thought I saw a figure standing in the distance. Waiting. Story 3: The Shadow in the Cabin. I've always loved camping alone. There's something about being deep in the woods, away from everything, that brings me peace. No cell service, no distractions. Just me, a fire, and the sounds of nature. At least that's how I used to feel. This happened 2 summers ago. I had taken a week off work and decided to stay in a small cabin I had rented deep in the Appalachian Mountains. It wasn't fancy, just one room, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom, but it had a fire pit outside and miles of hiking trails. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first night, the first day was great. I hiked for hours, cooked dinner over the fire, and watched the sun set behind the trees. By the time I crawled into bed, exhaustion had set in, and I fell asleep almost instantly. But in the middle of the night, something woke me. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. The room was dark. The only sound was the distant hoot of an owl. But something felt off. Then I heard it. A soft tap came from outside, right against the cabin's front door. I held my breath, listening. Tap, tap, tap. Not a knock, just tapping. Light, slow. I sat up, my heart pounding. I hadn't seen another person all day, and the nearest town was miles away. Who the hell would be out here at this hour? I reached for my flashlight, got out of bed, and moved slowly toward the window. I didn't pull the curtain back all the way, just enough to peek out. But I saw nothing. The porch was empty. The trees stood still, barely rustling in the wind. I waited. A minute passed. Then another. Nothing. Finally, I convinced myself it had just been a tree branch or an animal and went back to bed. But I didn't sleep well. The footprints. The next morning, I stepped outside and froze. There were footprints in the dirt just outside my cabin. Bare footprints. And they led right up to my door. A chill ran through me. The prints were small, like a child's, and they stopped at the entrance. But there were no prints leading away. I looked around, scanning the woods. Everything was still. Too still. I told myself it was some kind of prank. Maybe a hiker messing around. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. Who hikes barefoot in the middle of the night? And why would they just stand at my door? Tapping? Something felt wrong. I shook it off, spent the day hiking, and tried to forget about it. But that night, it happened again. The breathing. This time, I was already on edge. I locked the door, checked the windows, and kept my flashlight within arm's reach. Around 2 a.m., the tapping returned. Soft, slow, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up, my body stiff with fear. Then the sound changed. It wasn't tapping anymore. It was breathing, deep, ragged, right outside the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the window. But the second the beam hit the glass, the breathing stopped. I didn't move for what felt like forever. I just sat there, gripping the flashlight, staring at the door. Then, just when I thought it was over, something scratched the wood. Long, slow, clawing. I jumped out of bed, grabbed the knife I had packed, and shouted, "Who's there?" Silence. I took a deep breath, gathered every ounce of courage I had, and yanked the door open. Nothing. The night was silent. The trees stood motionless. But something was there, right at my feet. A single bare footprint, fresh, inside the cabin. The figure. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat on my bed, knife in hand, eyes locked on the door. As soon as the sun rose, I packed my bag and got the hell out of there. But as I was loading my car, something made me stop. I looked back at the cabin, at the window beside my bed, and for a split second I saw it. The figure, standing inside, small, barefoot, watching me leave. I never went back, and I never camped alone again.